philosophy. And in the spring of that year, my wife eloped to join me from India. I had met her in New York City a couple of years before in an art class. And she arrived to the astonishment of my colleagues. And we've raised 3 children. While we were in Athens, they went through the public schools. They're now more or less off on their own. But I've primarily been devoting my life in the last 40 years, I guess you could say, as a seeker of truth, as teaching and writing philosophy about all the great issues that philosophers address, and dealing with thousands of students from Georgia primarily, who are among them, some of the brightest, most thoughtful people one can meet. And I've also been active in the Democratic Party. I'm a committee member, and I've been going to their meetings, voting quite frequently, and very recently I joined an effort as a kind of founding member of a union that's attempting to unionize all of the staff at the University of Georgia. Now has enough people that it's going to be certified in the next weeks as a local of the Communication Workers of America.
That's me.
That's Jan.
Now I was
I'm a
told that I should never
CWA
talk
person.
about unions in Georgia in general, but
Here you can.
I think one needs to
good.
talk about unions.
Yes.
It's a good
But
place
we've
to
been
get some
talking about
feedback as
unions,
well,
yeah.
Yes.
Nice
Yes,
cozy
indeed.
group.
But I'll say one thing about my experience as a participant in the Democratic Party. I've never been to a meeting that has discussed what we stand for. Instead, the meeting is simply concerned with the brass tacks of raising money, voter registration, what we're going to do for this or that candidate, but never to think about what we're going to stand for. And I think we have to do that, especially now because, we really are in the weakest position that the Democratic Party has been in our lifetime. And although some of that weakness can be attributed to the gerrymandering and the unrestricted flow of money into politics, I think a lot of it has to do with the failure of Democratic Party candidates to advance the kind of bold proposals that used to be part of the Democratic Party agenda. And instead it's allowed a demagogue like Trump to say, I have the solution for jobs. I have the solution for all of you who are struggling, who can't get by. All of these people, particularly white working class people, especially in the South, who've deserted the Democratic Party and been seduced by people like Trump and other Republican candidates. And I think that the problem is a fundamental one. I think it reflects some of the omissions in our own Constitution. Because our Constitution lays out political and legal rights. And we all know that for centuries they were interpreted not as rights that applied to all, but as privileges. That at the very beginning, only a white man with a certain amount of property could count on being able to exercise all of the rights that are in the Constitution. And so we've had 2 centuries of civil rights struggles, which have succeeded to a great degree in extending those rights to all adults. But we've seen that we have not thereby provided the freedoms individuals need to take care of their families, to participate independently in society, in the economy, to participate as equals in the political process. And this is not something new. When the slaves were emancipated after the Civil War, in every southern state, they realized that it wasn't enough to now be freed of slavery, to have, if there were men, the right to vote, to be treated as equals before the law, who could serve on juries and testify against not just blacks, but whites. They knew that one needed more to have freedom. One needed, as it was expressed in every southern state at that time, they demanded land so they could support themselves and public education, which did not exist in the South. So they could then function and have an independent livelihood. Well, these things didn't quite go through. Thanks to their initiatives, there was a public education system set up in the South, but it ended up being separate and unequal. But 80 years later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt made a speech that I think inspires me quite a bit, and I think it should inspire all of us. It was his last address to Congress when he was already quite ill and soon would die. And he said, our Constitution is not sufficient in face of modern economic conditions to provide people with the ability to exercise their freedom. We need to add to it a new Bill of Rights. A new Bill of Rights that will give people the economic independence and security they need to be able to take care of their families, function in the political process. And I feel that we haven't fulfilled that agenda, and we need to. And I want to lay out before you a couple of bold proposals, all of which have been implemented either in other countries or in a certain degree in our own country. And I think that you might ask yourself, what are the rights that our Constitution has not given us that we need in order to be independent, and that all the civil rights struggles have not provided us with? So that now, as we all know, we're the most unequal nation in the developed world, the least social mobility. The disadvantage of blacks has not been eliminated. African Americans have twice the rate of unemployment. They make 2/3 the income. They have 1/13 of the wealth of an average white family. And the difference between the wealth and power of women and men has not changed. I mean, here in Jasper County, I was reading the statistics from the last census. The median income of males in Jasper County is $40,000. The median income of women is $27,000. So, there are still these huge discrepancies, and I think there are solutions that are not being looked at. So I just want to ask you, what do you think is a right that we have not been given, that we need to uphold? What do you think is a core right? And it's a right that, has sort of fallen out of political discussion.
The right to as much education as you can get.
Well, that's one thing, certainly. The right to have access to education at all levels and not have that a privilege based upon how much wealth you have. That's certainly
Like, say,
important.
in Germany, anybody can go to college. It doesn't cost anything.
But let me ask you this. If you have education, is that going to be enough?
No.
What else do you need?
You gotta have something to offer that's where they can get a job.
Exactly.
I mean, I can have a PhD, but
Exactly.
if I
Exactly. You need
they
a
don't
job.
hire me on a job, it didn't matter.
You need a job.
I think in my case, I can only speak for me. Education offered me limited ways of making a living because you were fit into a box.
Yeah.
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 And
to
you
be a
didn't.
teacher or a nurse.
Well, back then, in the '60s, you were limited on what you could learn to do. And now I think the schools are going more for technical things, which are realistic. I mean, we all need plumbers, electricians.
But it's still the
We
case.
needed that.
It's still the case. You can have the training.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people are going into these technical fields. They're going
Yeah.
to science. But they're not all finding jobs. And it's not because they're lazy.
That's true.
It's not because there's anything wrong with them. The marketplace does not provide jobs to everyone who wants a job.
Mm-hmm.
So we can talk about the true right to work. And I think this is really a basic social right, which is a core element if we really want to eliminate poverty.
Those
If
are
we really-
words. That's
and-
all that is.
yeah.
In some cases,
Yeah,
it's just
and-
words.
Yeah, and if we want to get rid of the discrepancy in unemployment rates, we can get rid of unemployment in general. And to do that, our government has to step in as an employer when the market does not, and provide jobs for people. And this is not make work, because there are all sorts of things that need to be done that serve our community that are not being done by business right now. And for example, what do you think should have people put to work to do in Jasper County that is not being done?
Transportation.
Exactly,
We
transportation.
have zip, not
Yeah,
even a
yeah.
taxi cab.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, think of all the people stranded in the counties of the 10th district who can't get to where they need to go. People who don't have the money
Can't
to have
even
their
get
own
to the
car,
doctors.
or they're too old
We're-
to drive.
How about
very-
Uber? We need to organize Uber.
No, I don't want to do. We have dirt roads here, right?
Yeah.
Do you know that?
Yeah.
Dirt and gravel roads.
I was in
And
the
we-
Georgia of them during.
And the road that I live on, since my husband is the county commissioner, there's no way that I told him I do not put one speck of gravel on that road, because that's a bad thing to take care of yourself and not take care. And our neighbors are so mad because they just knew he was going to get the road paved, but that's not going to happen.
Well, think of all this infrastructure work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people in Georgia now who are suffering from hookworm in rural areas. Why? because they depend upon a, what do you call it? They're not on a sewer line. They depend upon their own septic tank. The septic tank is not kept up. And as a result, the sewage is leaking around and they're getting infected, you know.
Well,
as a
Well,
third
we have a
world
lot of
country.
septic tanks here.
So there are all
That's all
sorts of,
there is.
there are all sorts of things that can be done. Think of all the substandard housing there is.
Oh, God.
Think of the lack of affordable housing. I've heard of many counties in the 10th district where they can't hire teachers because, or have difficulty hiring teachers because they can't find housing in the county.
That's
teachers
just
can
right
afford.
here.
That's Jasper.
So I think you can think of a lot of things, including broadband for all. I mean, how can you function in society today if you and your children don't have access to the internet? And then we think of all the care we need. You know, people who need home care, schools that need assistance, schools that need more staff, upgrading buildings. And then think of all the arts and music and performances that ought to be
Don't even
offered to the
mention that,
public.
we don't.
right? Now, all of this was done, because you might say, how can such a big task be undertaken? It was done, as you know, during the Great Depression, when we were in our greatest economic crisis ever, when FDR introduced the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps. The population of the country was only 117 million, not 325 million. And we were much poorer. The wealth of the nation was only 6% of what it is today. But still, they put to work 8.5 million people. And we're still benefiting from the public works they established. Now, Roosevelt in 1944, when he made the speech I was referring to, you know, he realized that
Is
what he
that,
did.
is that the speech where he talks about his dog?
I don't.
Because I think
so.
that's the
Yeah.
last speech where he talks about the media.
Yeah.
He said they're so low down they even go after my dog. Because I've
Yeah.
seen, have y'all seen that one?
Yeah.
His dog
Yeah.
speech?
I don't think it's that one.
No? Okay, sorry.
But in it, he said, you know, look, the Works Progress Administration was something that was put forward as a kind of emergency measure to deal with the Depression, where we had 25% unemployment. But in 1944, he says, we need to have this as an ongoing thing. We have to guarantee jobs to everyone on a permanent basis. So we can do this, and it's something that is good for business. Because when everyone is working and getting income, you don't have these fluctuations in consumer demand that cause crises and business cycles, where businesses can't invest because they don't have people to buy their goods. This produces a very steady amount of buying power for the public at large. And needless to say, when you have the tightest of labor markets, this is going to allow people who already have jobs to be in a stronger position to bargain for better wages. So here we're talking about something I really think is a life changer. And, you know, think of the young people who either if they're dropping out or they come out of school or they graduate from college, they face twice the unemployment we do. If they're African American, they face 4 times the unemployment others do. What if instead of facing the uncertainty they have and the hopelessness they can feel in this, the most affluent nation in human history, we would guarantee them jobs that will serve the common good? And then think of crime and prison population. You know, many people languishing in prison are there because they couldn't find a legal way of earning a living. And when they come out of prison, they're going to have a tougher time finding them. What if instead they knew when they come out of prison, there's a job awaiting them that will serve the common good? And I know you served in the military. When you came back, and other people who we send out to defend our freedoms come back from military service, you know, you can't be sure of finding a job. You know, one of the horrible spectacles in our society are homeless veterans. There are plenty of them. Well, what if instead everyone coming back from war knew they had a job awaiting them? And what if all of us, who may be lucky enough to have full-time jobs, we don't have to worry about being laid off, downsized, etc. So this is a game changer. But I think we all know it's not the whole answer, because here in Georgia, throughout the country, there are millions of Americans who are working harder than anyone else on the planet, working not just one job, but 2 or 3 jobs because they make poverty wages. So if we're going to have guaranteed employment, we also have to ensure that there is a new fair minimum wage. And I say fair minimum wage, not living wage. Because a living wage, in a way, is just a prescription for a kind of poverty. You get your basic needs covered, but not much else. And you could adjust it for inflation and still, you're not getting much else. we need a minimum wage that ties wage levels to the growth of the economy so that everyone will share in our rising prosperity. And we had that from 1945 to 1973. Wages in general rose as the economy grew, as productivity increased. And for that reason, large parts of the population had a rising standard of living. That stopped in 1973. Wages have stagnated since then. And what does that mean? Well, our country has become more and more unequal. So now we have the most unequal distribution of wealth in the developed world. And that's also led, contrary to all the trickle-down theories, this movement of wealth to the upper few has led to a decline in economic growth. Our economy has grown at half the rate it used to. And there's an obvious reason. The people who now have, who are the richest 1%, who have as much wealth as the bottom 90%, they can't spend their wealth. It's sitting there by and large, unused. Whereas we spend much more of our income because we need it. So if we were to ensure that everyone had a fair minimum wage, not a living wage, we would increase not only the prosperity of everyone, but the growth of the economy. And then you might ask, well, what do you think would be a fair minimum wage? What do you think? You know, people talk about a living wage of $15 an hour. You have to really ask yourself, what can you really do on $15 an hour? Although, let's face it, many people are not getting anywhere near that.
I was about to say, for some
But-
people, it
yeah.
would be.
But what do you think
Double
would
what
what do you
you're
think would be
making
the
now.
fair minimum? Let me give you some figures to give you a range of what's possible. You know, the national income in this country is $18 trillion. $18 trillion. There are 160 million people who earn a living in this country. About half the population actually earns a living. If you divide 18 trillion by 160 million, you get an average income of $112,000. That's how much income is out there. And I think you know that few Americans make six figures, only 7%.
What
So there's room to bring up the bottom. And I don't like talking about a middle class at all. Because if you're trying to promote a middle class, you're accepting that there's a lower class. We should eliminate the lower class. We should bring everything up to a fair minimum wage. And I would say, we can take as a guideline, what would happen if we adjusted the minimum wage, not just for inflation, but for the growth of the economy and productivity? So back in 1968, the minimum wage was $1.60. If you adjust it for inflation, in today's dollars, it's $10.50. But if you adjust it for the growth of the economy and productivity gains, it comes to $22 an hour. I'm putting forward $20 an hour as a fair minimum wage. It can be adjusted for further economic growth. And it's doable. You know, if every business, big and small, is required to pay their employees a fair wage, none of them are in a competitive disadvantage when they do so. And they have ways of dealing with this. And we could, of course, help them out. We could provide tax incentives for any business that increases wages. But we can save the souls of entrepreneurs by requiring all of them to pay fair wages. You know, right now, if you're an entrepreneur, you may want to help your employees, you may want to be good to the environment, you may want to have safe products, but if any of this involves extra expenditures and your competitors are meaner and leaner, you can't be ethical and competitive at the same time. But if we want to make entrepreneurs ethical and viable and competitive, we have to require them all to meet the basic standards of justice. And this is part of it. Now, you spoke of a problem in terms of how your opportunities were limited. And in some respect, I think because you were a woman.
Sure.
And I think the examples you gave indicate that a remedy like equal pay for equal work is not enough. Because there are whole types of occupations in which you find women and also minorities. And if everyone in those occupations were to be paid the same, that would still not remove the great disparities in income between them. And I think part of the problem is that employees don't have any power. And I'll dare to mention unions in this respect. You know, unionization is now down to 6%. In the private sector.
Wages have gone
You know,
down.
Exactly.
The
In
right
fact,
to work for less.
in fact, the decline in union membership is directly tied to the decline of the share of wages in the national wealth. So we have to think about how can we even the playing field between employer and employee. And I think there are two ways of doing it. One, we have to think of the structure of corporations. We have a board of directors that currently is in cahoots with the CEO, and they don't take any advice from their employees. They can do whatever they want. And so CEOs are being paid 300 times on average what their employees make. They're making all the decisions on outsourcing, on automation, on whether they're going to play a role in the political process. What if instead we required all corporate boards to have 50% of their members drawn from non-managerial employees? They do that in Europe. Germany has a system. They call it worker co-determination. What if we had a requirement that the boards of directors on corporations had to have half their members made up of non-managerial employees who are elected by their peers?
You know, most boards are just
That would have a big difference.
Yeah.
That would
Safe
change
on all
what
the
goes on
boards.
in the
It's
business
just
world. And the,
secure.
and the other side of it, you know, the union movement is really extremely weak. I'm in an effort now trying to organize, but we don't have any legal protections. It's going to be very much an uphill battle. Unions are not succeeding in expanding their membership, and you can see what they're fighting against. You now have this gig economy, where now businesses are getting rid of full-time employees. They use the internet. They can get people to do things anywhere in the world, any time of day, in isolation, with no fixed amount of hours, no benefits. It's much cheaper for businesses to do this. And they're working in isolation. I think we need to require businesses to engage in collective bargaining with the representatives of their employees. Now, all of this still doesn't deal with the problem that we're talking about when we speak.
And I was gonna ask you,
Yeah.
to me, still, this is coming from the top anyway,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
It's not like, I can remember when unions was everywhere, including teachers, don't you remember when we had unions, but.
Well, you know what the situation is in Georgia with the right to work law.
Right,
I mean, I'm an educator. We're trying to set up a union, but state law says
that's right.
we're not allowed to engage in collective bargaining, even if we form a union.
I remember, that when teachers had unions.
They still
You know,
do
sure.
some places. They do in New York.
I do, I wasn't, but I remember when there were unions and,
And where they do, they have better wages and better working
Well,
conditions.
the big story is of Wisconsin right now. If you read about what's happened in Wisconsin since they got rid of the unions to the
Public
teachers.
service
Mhm.
unions.
My thing that I'm so concerned about now is all the corporations that run their money through foreign entities, and that's why we're missing so many dollars. It used to be called double Dutch treat, but now, since the EU started, they told Ireland, you're gonna charge them 12% taxes. So now they've moved on to another place called Jersey, the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel, and they even found the Queen had like millions of dollars there. But Microsoft, Apple, two of the big corporations, and Coca-Cola. And I had heard about the Coca-Cola deal years ago, but who wants to step on Coke's toes, right? But I did taxes for somebody at this little tax company, and she was a financial person for Coca-Cola, and she would shift money in the middle of the night over to Indonesia to get it away so that the United States could not tax it. But here we support, they got their name all over Microsoft, Apple, Coca-Cola, all these huge corporations, but they're crying that they have to pay too many corporate taxes. Where are they paying corporate taxes? I'd like to know. They're not paying them here.
And if you take all of these corporations like Apple, which is now the most valuable company in human
Yes.
history,
Right.
and they're putting all their money
They're running
abroad
it
in
through
tax havens,
offshore.
and they're completely non-union,
Mm-hmm.
except for the top brass and the top software engineers. They pay close to minimum wages to the people who work in the Apple store. At the
What about
Genius
the
Bar.
ones that build the things?
And that
They're
too.
slave
Yeah,
labor.
they're working in China and so forth. So I think we really have to think about how we can transform the structure of corporations from within, provide employees with more equality on the bargaining. But I think there's still this problem that I think is really a primary reason why we still have these great differences in opportunity between men and women and between minorities and the rest of us. And part of it has to do with how people have great difficulty taking care of their families and earning a livelihood. Because you find you can't do both. You know, if you have to take care of children, and now more and more as we're living older, you have to take care of elders who at a certain point in their life are going to need care, maybe around the clock. It's almost impossible to do both because of the great costs of childcare, the great costs of elder care. So if we're going to make it, and we all know that women bear the brunt. You know, in single parent families, 83% of the people who are in charge of the single parent family are women. More than 2/3 of the family members who take care of elders are women. And that's a crucial reason why women are not able to pursue their career on an even footing. And if you don't pursue your career on an even footing, you're not going to get equal retirement earnings or benefits either. So that's one reason why in Jasper County, the median income of men may be $40,000. The median income of women is $27,000. So what can we do to change this? Well, I think on the one hand, we have to require employers to give us all the paid time we need to take care of our families. So we should have paid emergency leave, not just emergency leave that's unpaid. That's not going to be affordable. We need to have what they have in Europe, a mandatory 1-month paid vacation for everyone who works. So you can spend time with your family. And then what they also have in many countries in Europe, 9-month paid parental leave. So when someone is born in a family, the mother, or if in some cases the father, can take care of the child. But then you still have the problem of childcare later on. How can you earn a living when, you know, childcare, I think, costs on average $6,000 a year. Elder care is a lot more expensive than that if you need someone cared for 24 hours, 24/7. So what if we do something that also has been done elsewhere? We have free public childcare, like we have free public schools, and we have free public elder care. Then women can actually pursue their careers and know that their children, their elders are taken care of. And we also need to wipe out childhood poverty, which now affects almost 50% of our young people. And I think to do that, we have to recognize that guaranteed jobs and a fair minimum wage is not enough, because the more children you have, the more resources you need. So we need to have child allowances, like you have in many countries in Europe. And I would propose, let's start at $500 per month per child. That's $6,000 a year. Now that sounds like a lot. There's 74 million children in America. You multiply $6,000 a year by 74 million, you get something like $400+ billion. Now again, that sounds like a lot, but our national wealth is the most wealth any nation has ever accumulated in human history. It's over $90 trillion. And the top 1% owns almost 40% of it. If we had a wealth tax of 1%, just 1% on the wealth of the top 1%, it would pay for child allowances for all our children and wipe out childhood poverty. And we can do that. We can do that.